Have you heard of Fatima and the Miracle of the Sun? Well, if you haven't, you're going to hear about it right now from our good friend L.A. Marzulli, who in July returned from a long visit in Portugal and the city of Fatima.
Yeah, we actually landed in Lisbon. We did interviews in Lisbon, Fatima, and Porto. We interviewed some incredible people from all different disciplines, neuroscientists, for instance, historians, professors. Pretty much everybody on board was a PhD. We also interviewed Frederica Claro de Armada, who is Fina de Armada's daughter. Fina de Armada was the researcher, the journalist, the author who had access to the sanctuary. And the sanctuary in Fatima is where all the original documents from 1917 are kept. And we got to give the people the backstory, what we're talking about here. 100 years ago, and we're in the anniversary of Fatima. 100 years ago, something happened in this it was little more than a village, not even a village, more like a hamlet without a church, pretty much. Little stone houses, some of those are still there, and exactly the way they were in 1917. There are no roads, there are no airplanes in Portugal at the time. No airplanes, 1917. World War I is raging. The Bolshevik Revolution is brewing. It's a very tumultuous, tenuous time. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but there are hundreds of apparition sites where some entity has appeared to people for literally thousands of years. And Portugal was steeped in a matriarchal society, and they worshiped the sacred feminine. We found all this out when we got to Portugal. But getting back on track with the story, 3 shepherds are tending their flocks. Lucia, who was 10, Francisco, who was 9, and Jacinta, who was 7. These are very small, young children. And an entity appears to them, and they go back and they tell their parents, and well, who was this entity? What was it? And you know, it's interesting, Gary, when originally the film was called Mary of the Bible or A Harbinger of Deception. And we actually got to Fatima, to the sanctuary, which is this unbelievable multi-million-dollar complex. It looks like a mini Vatican. It can hold upwards of 1 million people. 1 million people that can stand and partake in the festivities. So this is a big deal. And when we got there, we took Mary of the Bible completely off the table, and we focused on this one dynamic, one particular of the entire event.
Yeah, now, I've heard of Fatima for years. I
Sure.
think most people have obliquely. Maybe some pay attention to it and some don't. But essentially what you hear about is the 3 little children having an apparition of a supernatural being who tells them something, and then there is this huge miracle of some sort. And that's pretty much it, except that later on we learned that this apparition gave the oldest girl a kind of a message, which was kept a deep, dark secret. Now that's what I think, if you know about Fatima at all, you know that story. But you go to Fatima, Portugal, and you begin to ferret out the details of the story, and it's way, way different.
We drew, and the people that we interviewed all throughout the film, we took the story from the 1917 handwritten documents, which are kept at the sanctuary in Fatima, Portugal. Because the further out you go from 1917, the story begins to change and change dramatically. But when we went back to the 1917 records, and again, it's Lucia, who is the main seer, is only 10 years old at the time. And the parish priest who was there, Father Fiera, is basically interrogating these kids, and perhaps harshly. I mean, I'll grant the story that I mean, he really held their feet to the fire, almost literally, because he believed it was demonic. And so this went on from May 13th, 1917 to October 1917, always on the 13th of the month. And obviously the first apparition, it was just the 3 children. By the second, third, fourth, fifth apparition, the crowds are swelling because word is getting out that something is going on here. And what we found out too, and again, we took Mary the Bible off the table, but they were kept asking the children, who's this person? What is this entity called? And where is she from? And Lucia said, she's from the sky. She said she was from the sky. This was a small entity, about 4 feet tall, that only communicated to the children telepathically. She never moved her mouth. And we didn't even talk about that. We kept that off the table because that in itself is incredibly controversial. What we went to was the so-called miracle of the sun. And in September of that year, 1917, the parish priest and the officials asked the children, go and ask this lady, this apparition, to give us a sign. We need a sign. We need some kind of a sign. So they go and they ask the lady, the entity, to give a sign. And this woman, this person, this entity states, there will be a sign on October 13th. Word gets out. Remember, this has been going on now since May. So now it's September, we're moving into October. October 13th, 1917, there's upwards of 70,000 people in the field, and we've got a shot of it right on the front cover of it. It has been raining all night. The people were there at daybreak. They have umbrellas. People are absolutely drenched to the bone. The field is muddy. The children are there, and they're waiting for the apparition to appear. And 12 o'clock comes and goes because the apparition was supposed to come at noon. It comes and goes, nothing happens. Again, it's been raining all day. The clouds are covering the sun. Very, very dark and gloomy day, ominous day. All of a sudden, the clouds part. The sun is there, and that's great. A change of weather, a break in the weather. But what happens is this, and this is from the eyewitness testimonies that gave their testimonies to Father Fiera during the interrogations from May 1917 up to October. But the witnesses in the field, upwards of 70,000 that day, are talking about what they are seeing. The clouds part, there's the sun. Then another cloud comes in front of the sun. And out of that cloud comes an object which spins like this, falls like a leaf, and does this 3 times. Okay, the phenomenon there lasts for upwards of 12 to 14 minutes. There are photographers in the field that day, several of them. Now, it's 1917. People don't have cell phones, no camcorders. We're talking about the old-fashioned box cameras
And by
with
the
glass
way,
plates.
with glass plates and so forth, those were slow cameras.
Very, very slow.
You couldn't catch action on
No,
one.
you had to be very, very still.
Yeah.
So that's what we're looking at. And something occurs. This object comes out, does this thing 3 times, and then there is what we call a flyby. The object passes over the people's heads at less than 100 feet. That's very close. And so the idea of the miracle of the sun, we need to look at that. That name was given by a reporter reporting for a paper in Lisbon, and he sort of made it up, the miracle of the sun. We know this, the sun, if the sun is the size of a watermelon and the earth is the size of a head of a match, there's no way that the sun left the solar system and flew over those people. It wasn't the sun. Everyone would have been incinerated. That's not what happened. Something else happened. And what most people don't understand, in 1917, people have never seen a flying object. In Portugal, there were no airplanes. It's not there.
It was kind of a backward place technologically.
It's very, very much so. Now, since then, it's become, Portugal's a beautiful country, very modernized, wonderful. We enjoyed it. Beautiful country. People are warm and friendly. But in 1917, we're talking dirt roads. There's automobiles that are parked around there. None of this is in the official records that people hear, but it's in the official records in the transcripts. And we're going to talk about this in part 2, but I'll give you a teaser. In part 1, when we call it the flyby, when this object, whatever it was, and we'll talk about that more in a minute, came over the heads of the crowds, their clothes, which were sopping wet, dried miraculously, all right? The clothes dried. People standing in the path of the flyby felt heat. People reported like what looked like radiation burns, really bad sunburn. So there's this phenomena that's going on, why the flyby is taking place. As it's taking place, the hoods of automobiles pop up, windshields are broken out, motors, gasoline engines are spontaneously combusting. People thought it was the end of the world. People were terrified for the most part. There is a lawyer and a doctor and other witnesses who have come on the record in the 1917 transcripts, and they say this: I looked up and saw a dull silver disc. That's what they say. I looked up, what came out of the clouds, this object was a dull silver disc. Wasn't the sun. Some people describe it as a metallic orb. Others talk about that this disc, when it spun, gave out all these different colors. So there's no doubt something happened there, but we're disputing what it was.
What I'm after, in my mind, is certainty about this thing, and when an educated individual from that era, someone with an education, the ability to make observations and write down what he saw, says a dull silver disc, you would tend to believe that. And does that ever sound familiar? I mean, to you of all people who have pursued the UFO phenomenon for how many years now?
Decades.
And by the way, I just happen to have a copy of L.A. Marzulli's Watchers series. There are 11 DVDs in here, and much of this material in these DVDs is devoted to the UFO phenomenology. And there are many aspects of it.
Very much so.
There's everything from the hardware to the evil personages behind the hardware, and I mean you've covered it all. So for you, this must have been like wow, a further revelation of the UFO phenomenon.
Well, the subtitle to the to the DVD is "Miracle, the Son, or a Harbinger of Deception," and again, the reason why we went there. I felt the Lord leading us there, to begin with. I felt like we were called to go and really explore this. It's the 100th anniversary. But part of me, a harbinger of deception, looks at this, and it's a warning, because the 70,000 people in that field, their worldview, their paradigm was changed in an instant. They saw something, they had nothing in their worldview or in their paradigm to, what am I looking at? What is this? And the story begins to change over the years. But when you go back again to the original 1917 documents, dull silver disc is used by multiple witnesses. And that to me is incredibly troubling. It was not the sun. The sun did not leave its position in the sky. It was something which came out of the cloud. And again, this thing spun on its axis. We actually, in the film, we took a clip from an interview that was done decades ago with really the woman that brought this all out to the forefront, Fina de Armada, and Joaquim Fernandez. And they teamed up together and wrote this book, Celestial Lights. And Fina has passed away. She died in 2014, but Joaquim Fernandez is in the film. And they participated in a debate with a group of priests who were Fatimists that believed in the apparitions. And it's a very interesting exchange, but there's this one priest who was actually there at Fatima in 1917 as a small boy. And he goes on the record, and we took that little clip and we used it in the film. And the priest's own words are this: the disc changed color. That's what he says. The disc changed color into a tan, and it began to spin and descend that we thought we were going to be crushed by it. This is years later now, he entered the priesthood. Something happened, we're not disputing that. But what was it really? I mean, if it was they call it the miracle of the sun, it's a misnomer. It was not the sun. The sun did not leave its place, in our solar system. Every astronomer on the planet would have known that. So it was something else.
And the backstory, and there's a couple of other aspects and details we'll get to in a minute, but the backstory of the children, particularly the young woman Lucia, seeing an quote-unquote apparition, dominated the whole narrative for decades, because it was her, I suppose, she was charged by this apparition with a secret message, which she was supposed to transmit or keep somehow. And the message, the secret of Fatima, became mythology for decades.
It became mythos, but here's what we discovered, and this we're going to deal with this in part 2. So I'm giving you a heads up. What we discovered was, out of the 3 seers, Lucia was the only one to make it into adulthood. Francisco died of the flu, never made it into his teenage years. Jacinta passed away 2 years later. So Francisco and Jacinta we can't talk to them. They're still very small children when they pass away. But Lucia is 16 years old. So it's 6 years after the events. The Jesuits come, the Vatican, I believe it was the Jesuits who come, and they take Lucia and they put her into a convent with a vow of silence. With a vow of silence. 11 years later, in 1928, that is when Lucia is told to write down the secrets, which she does 11 years later.
Wow.
11 years later. In the 1917 documents, there is not one word anywhere about Russia. It's not there. And that was one of the big deal secrets, where consecrate Russia to my sacred heart. And I'm not trying to disparage Catholics here, or that's not what we're not about. What we're looking at is, if this so-called secret happened 11 years later, why, or if it's true, why don't we hear anything about it in the 1917 transcripts? It's not there, Gary. It is, the word Russia is not mentioned at all. It's not there. All this comes 11 years later. And this is why, and you know, you get into the whole conspiracy thing. There was a gag order on Lucia. There's no doubt about it.
And the funny thing about this is that in 1917 we had the Bolshevik Revolution and the rise to power of very, very evil dictators in Russia. So Russia would have been on people's minds. And are you saying that something got confabulated here?
I think, and I'm leaning towards confabulation, because she's handled, she's managed. And again, if I go to the original records, and I keep harping on that, because those are handwritten, and these are witnesses who were there at the event and talking about what they are seeing when it's still fresh in their mind. And the further out you go, to 1928, 1934, into the 40s, it gets stranger and stranger. And I believe the fact that a 16-year-old girl was whisked off to a convent with a vow of silence, I take umbrage with that, and it causes me to look at it with a certain amount of suspicion. Something is going on there. And the fact that the secrets, the so-called secrets, come out in 1928, and you can go to a Catholic website, which is where I pulled some of this information from, and it's right there. It's the history of Lucia, and in 1928 is when these secrets come out.
And this became very much an enigma of the Roman Catholic Church, just because the apparition that Lucia saw was thought to be the Virgin Mary. And this is the way everybody remembers it. It's always remembered that way. And yet when you go back to the original, you discover, well, wait a minute, it was an apparition, but was it identified?
She never called herself Mary, ever. It's not there. And it was Lucia's uncle. I mean, look, we spent 2 weeks, you know, I read up on this before we got there. We spent 2 weeks, we talked to people who have plumbed this information for decades. We talked to some, what I believe are the world's experts on what really happened and the events of Fatima. And what we discovered was Lucia's uncle said, well, who else can it be but Mary of the Bible? And that's how it locked in. Just like Miracle of the Sun. It wasn't the sun. A newspaper reporter gives this tag on it, and it goes viral. And everybody calls it the Miracle of the Sun. The sun did not, you know, if we can agree on that, then we can start backpedaling from there. Because if people, if the sun really left its orbit and really descended on the crowd, then we're looking at a whole different deal. But if it didn't, if it wasn't the sun, then what was it? And if it wasn't the sun, we need to start deconstructing from that point and go backwards. What most people don't understand, and we discovered this when we were in Portugal, is that Portugal was a matriarchal society. And it was steeped in the worship of the sacred feminine before the Romans got there, with the Temple of Diana and all of that. So when you go back into antiquity, there's a goddess called Mora, and that's who these people are worshiping, a principality that we read about in Ephesians 6. An archon, a principality, a cosmocrator, is over this territory. And there is worship of this female entity. What most people don't understand is there are hundreds of apparition sites all through Portugal. We visited several of them.
Now, I want to stop you right there because a minute ago you were at this point and I interrupted you. And it's the point where this disc comes down close to the crowd and car engines catch on fire, their windshields are broken. But something else happened, and it was that it was a rainy day. Everybody is soaking wet, and take it from there.
Everyone is soaking wet, the clothes dry. The people on the path for the flyby, their clothes are dry.
Instantly.
Instantly. The ground is dry instantly.
Wow.
And there are burns. There are like what we would call now radiation burns.
A bad sunburn.
A very bad sunburn.
Wow.
Which is when you go into, and I realize I'm jumping into modernity and into some woo-woo stuff with some people, but when you actually look at the ufology and people who have had encounters, that is one of the signs. They'll have like radiation burns on their skin. All this was reported in 1917 in the original handwritten transcripts.
This in 1917, at a very crucial time in world history, and particularly European history, this happened. And how many people were there?
Upwards of 70,000.
And all of them experienced
Witnessed it.
They witnessed it, and they experienced the drying of the clothing. I'm intrigued by the car engines that caught fire. That means it's some kind of very, very powerful radiation.
Windshields bursting out of the cars.
Which means superheating the glass,
Yes.
so that it expanded and popped.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly.
You can't argue with something
Yeah.
like that. Something really did happen.
There's no doubt something happened. And there are photographs, and we use a lot of those black and white photographs of the crowd that day. And when I sat there and I talked to two men on camera, it's in the film, which is fascinating. And they talk about the glass plates, which are still in the possession of at the sanctuary in Fatima, which is, again, the sanctuary at Fatima. When we got there, Gary, I mean, it's dialed in. This place is huge, and it's all about holding 1 million people. And, you know, look, people can believe whatever they want to believe. There's a caveat right up front in the movie. In fact, I say millions of Catholics, pilgrims, come to Fatima every year. Millions of Muslims encircle the Kaaba stone. Millions of Hindus worship at Guru Puja. Millions of Buddhists worship at thousands of temples all over Asia. We're not trying to disparage anyone's belief system. Believe what you want to believe. We're saying that if it was not the miracle of the sun, if it was some sort of a craft coming through the clouds, and we've got eyewitness testimony, that's what they're telling us. They're not making it up.
And in this case, unlike many, many other UFO apparitions, the time and date was given in advance. Be there on that date.
And this is what people don't know. And we discovered this, and it's in the film. There was a group of psychics who met, and I'm talking more than one, a group. And they would sit around in tables, and they would practice something called automatic writing. And this one psychic, as they were all channeling this information, the handwriting was backward, and it was signed Stella Matutina, the bright morning star. That's how the message was signed. And it stated that on May 13th of that year, something wondrous was going to happen. This group of psychics printed that message in the paper in Lisbon, announcing it on May 13th, something wondrous was going to happen.
We'll have to talk about the identity of that Brighton Morning Star individual who wrote backwards. That's kind of suspicious.
Very suspicious.
L.A., I think, has a real gift for going to far-flung places and digging out the truth of matters that people haven't been quite sure about. And you can really put that label on his latest DVD, Fatima, Miracle of the Sun or Harbinger of Deception. You can find this DVD on our online bookstore, prophecywatchers.com. click on the online bookstore, dial down. You'll find L.A.'s name right there in the bookstore, and you're going to find Fatima, Miracle of the Sun. Oh, and I got to tell you, I have watched this, and it's captivating. I suppose that's the word I would have.
Thank
for it.
you. Appreciate that.
And when you're talking to scientists, historians, people who know something, they live there, and it's a popcorn cruncher. It keeps you going. So I guarantee you'll learn about Fatima, and you'll be able to talk to your friends about it in the context, by the way, of our belief in Christ and our faith and our blessed hope, because that's where you always work. That's your perspective. And again, it's called Fatima, Miracle of the Sun, or Harbinger of Deception. Probably the best study on Fatima that is currently available for you right here in our online bookstore. As we always do, by the way, we put things in packages. We love packages around here, Prophecy Watchers, and we're putting together an L.A. Marzulli package. This is called The Collected Works of L.A. Marzulli. And here we have the Watchers series, 11 DVDs. His book is basically, it is a daily devotional called The Sunday Bun, an anthology of sermons and thoughts, devotional thoughts from L.A. Marzulli. Plus, the DVD we've just been talking about, The Collected Works of L.A. Marzulli. For your gift of $100, you can receive the whole package. And believe me, there is much there to digest, and we're going to be digesting it with L.A. on another broadcast. By the way, call the 800 number on your screen right now, and you can go straight through and order either the DVD by L.A. or the package, which we're calling The Collected Works of L.A. Marzulli. L.A., we got just a little over a minute. I don't think we've exhausted this topic. In fact, we've just barely scratched the surface, because I've got a lot of questions.
Okay.
And we need to ask them. But you came away from Portugal, and you had an experience there that, and I've talked with you, so I know that it impressed you in many, many ways. How did it change your thinking?
The spiritual warfare, when we got to Fatima, was off the hook. I've never experienced such a visceral attack, and I mean visceral attack.
Really?
And, yeah, and I actually wrote about it in Prophecy Watchers magazine. And it was at 3 in the morning, I'm going, Lord, why is this happening? And I felt the Holy Spirit tell me, trust the process. And it was the next day that we found out about the goddess worship, about the castrated priests that were part of the goddess worship, about this succubus called Moor who would have sex with the men and then kill them. All this was in ancient Portugal, which I had no idea about. And that completely blew us away.
And we're completely out of time. But you have laid the groundwork for a lot of future discussion, believe me. L.A. Marzulli, the adventurer, the man who goes to the source and finds out the truth. And he's driven to do that, and I'm glad he is. He shares his work with us. L.A., we'll talk to you again.
Thank you, Gary.
And I'm Gary Stearman. You keep watching. We are. Thanks for joining us on Prophecy Watchers. You can find us on the web at prophecywatchers.com. In the meantime, keep watching, everybody, and we'll see you soon.